What you're about to hear is a first-person confession, inspired by the real story, or perhaps the legend, of the MKUltra experiment. Just one voice from inside the lab, telling what should never be known. They asked me to control minds. At first I thought it was just another assignment, a challenge that could push the limits of science. They told me it was for the good of the nation. But as I stood there in that sterile lab, surrounded by needles and chemicals, I realized I was stepping into something much darker. I never imagined it would cost me my soul. In the beginning, it was all about the science, the promise of unlocking the deepest recesses of the human mind, of manipulating thoughts, of controlling behavior. But that was before the whispers started. Before the line between my experiments and my reality began to blur. I should have stopped. But by the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. The mind can be shaped, bent to one's will, but not without a price. I learned that the hard way. And now, the voices won't stop. I had never known a project quite like this. The briefing came through an encrypted channel, a call I was obligated to answer. The words were few and the instructions were clear. I was to step into the shadowy world of MKUltra, a program so secretive, even the details I was given felt incomplete. It was clear that nothing was as it seemed. They told me it was for the good of the nation, a higher cause, to help in a war that wasn't fought on battlefields, but in the minds of men. The Cold War was in full swing, and while the Soviet Union advanced its own dark experiments into mind control, the United States could not afford to be left behind. Psychological warfare was just as deadly as any nuclear weapon, and I was to be one of the architects of that weapon. I arrived at the facility, cold, grey, and devoid of anything resembling warmth. The walls were barren, the sterile lights casting an unforgiving glow over everything. It was like stepping into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. No one spoke unless it was necessary, and the few who did spoke in hushed tones, as if they feared even the walls might hear. The briefing was given in a dimly lit room where men in dark suits spoke in clipped tones. They spoke of mind control, of bending people's will to serve the greater good, and of using psychological manipulation and drugs, mainly LSD, to break down the mind's natural defenses. Their words were precise, each one carefully chosen to ensure that no one would question the morality of it all. You are to break the mind, rebuild it, make it more malleable, push the boundaries, one of the superiors said, leaning over the table toward me. His eyes glinted with an intensity that unsettled me. This is the future of warfare, and we need you to make it happen. Their faces were impassive, but the weight of their words sank deep into my gut. The more they spoke, the more I realized that the line between science and horror was razor thin. But what choice did I have? I was told that my country needed me. There was no room for hesitation. The Soviet Union was rumored to be developing its own version of this, using hypnotism, drugs, and other methods to control their soldiers and spies. We were in a race, and we couldn't afford to lose. The thought of being left behind, of not being at the forefront of this new frontier, twisted something inside me. The fear of failure began to seep into my thoughts, mingling with a dark curiosity. I didn't feel proud of my hesitation. Instead, I felt small. How could I resist? I had been handpicked for this. I had been trained for years to understand the human mind, to unravel its deepest, darkest secrets. I was a scientist after all. This was what I had always trained for. But then came the whisper of doubt, a flicker that passed in an instant but lingered in the back of my mind. What would happen to the people we experimented on? What if they broke? Would they ever be the same again? I ignored those thoughts. I pushed them aside and focused on the greater good. This is bigger than us, I thought. This is for the future, for the protection of everything we stand for. With that, I began to justify my involvement. The greater good, the survival of my country, the potential to control minds for the benefit of all. It was easy to ignore the nagging feeling deep within me. I had a role to play, and I was going to succeed. The first dose of LSD was ready. It was time to see just how far the human mind could be bent. The laboratory was pristine, but there was something unnerving about it. The bright, cold lights, the sterile white walls that reflected no warmth, no emotion. It was as if the very air itself had been scrubbed clean of anything organic. The smell of chemicals lingered, sharp and artificial, clinging to the back of my throat. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the soft hum of machinery that seemed too clinical, too precise. We were in a top-secret facility, hidden away from prying eyes, and yet it felt as if the world outside didn't exist anymore. The walls held no comfort, no reassurance. Every step I took echoed in the emptiness. The subjects arrived one by one, a mix of prisoners, volunteers, and innocent participants caught in the crossfire of government decisions. Some had been coerced, others willingly offered themselves, convinced they could be part of something bigger. They were all chosen for their resilience, their mental and physical endurance. I tried not to think of them as people. They were tools, nothing more. They weren't human to me anymore. They were subjects, variables in an experiment that was bigger than any of us. The humanity I had once clung to slipped away with every passing day, like sand through my fingers. The first subject, a middle-aged man with haunted eyes, was strapped to a metal table, his hands and feet bound tightly. He didn't resist. He just stared at the ceiling, as if he had already resigned himself to the fate that awaited him. We began the experiment by administering LSD, a small dose at first to measure its effects. It was supposed to open the mind, expand consciousness, break down the barriers between thought and reality. The drug was our key, the gateway to control. At first, nothing happened. The subject remained still, almost too still, his breathing shallow. I watched closely, noting every detail. Then, after what seemed like hours, the transformation began. His eyes fluttered, his body stiffened, and the first signs of confusion set in. I recorded every moment with clinical precision, noting his increased agitation and erratic movements. The room was thick with tension as he began to murmur incomprehensibly, his words tangled and nonsensical. It was clear that the drug was affecting him. But how far? How much could the mind be pushed before it broke? The other subjects followed suit, each reacting differently to the drug. One became paranoid, whispering about voices he heard in the walls. Others began to laugh uncontrollably, as though the world itself had become a grotesque joke. But the most unsettling part was how quickly they lost their sense of self. I documented everything, every twitch, every word, every second of their unraveling. I had been prepared for this. After all, mind control was never a clean process. The human mind was fragile, but the results, they were more profound than I had anticipated. The subjects were slipping away from themselves, descending into a world that only they could see. But the failures began to surface. The first signs of irreparable damage appeared sooner than I had expected. One subject's mind seemed to shatter entirely, his mind reduced to fragments of disconnected thoughts and nonsensical babbling. Another began to claw at his skin, desperate to escape something invisible, some horror that only he could perceive. I stopped for a moment and questioned it. Was this too much? Should I stop? But those questions quickly dissipated, swallowed by a growing obsession, the need to control, to push the boundaries of what was possible. The failure was inevitable. It was part of the process. If we were to control the mind, we had to break it first. My obsession deepened. This was no longer about the greater good. It was about proving something, to myself, to everyone. I needed to know just how far we could go, how much could we bend before the mind snapped entirely. The first experiment was a failure, yes, but it was also the beginning of something much larger, and I wasn't about to stop now. The experiments grew more intense with each passing day. The dosage increased, the isolation became longer, and the psychological manipulation took on darker forms. We were pushing boundaries that should never have been touched, testing the very core of human consciousness. LSD wasn't enough anymore. We needed to break the mind completely, rewire it to our will. I remember the first subject we placed in sensory deprivation. It was simple at first. An isolation chamber designed to shut out the world, to strip away everything the mind could cling to. It was supposed to induce vulnerability, to make the subject more malleable. The room was soundproof, the light dimmed to nothingness, leaving the subject alone with his thoughts. The man inside the chamber began to speak after just a few hours. At first, it was quiet murmurs, but soon his words grew frantic. His mind, deprived of its usual stimuli, began to twist. He was seeing things, strange hallucinations. The lines between reality and nightmare blurred. We watched through the observation glass as his eyes darted around the room, his breathing shallow and uneven. Was he talking to himself? Or was he speaking to something unseen, something only his fractured mind could comprehend? He reached for the glass, his hands trembling as if the world outside could offer him some salvation. But there was no salvation. In the weeks that followed, the experiments grew even more extreme. We ramped up the psychological pressure, increasing the isolation, pushing subjects to their breaking point. We wanted them to lose themselves, to become nothing but vessels of control. And then something began to happen, something I wasn't prepared for. I began to lose myself too. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing I could easily ignore, a flicker in the corner of my eye, a sound that couldn't be real. I told myself it was nothing, just exhaustion. But the longer I stayed in the lab, the more the lines between work and reality began to blur. I started to question my own thoughts. I would wake up from nightmares, but those nightmares didn't feel like dreams. They felt like memories, like I had lived them before. The faces of the subjects would haunt me when I closed my eyes. I would hear whispers, soft and distant, only to find the room empty when I turned around. It was as if the experiment had somehow crept into my own mind, warping it just as it had done to the subjects. I couldn't trust my own thoughts anymore. The boundaries between what was real and what was part of the experiment grew thinner by the day. In the observation room, the subjects were deteriorating in ways I couldn't explain. They began to speak in tongues, their voices disjointed and unnerving. Their eyes would lock onto mine, unblinking, as if they were trying to communicate with me through some hidden language. They didn't look human anymore. The isolation was taking its toll. They couldn't distinguish reality from the twisted world we had created. The lines between what was real and what was a hallucination had dissolved entirely. And in that moment, I began to wonder, could the mind ever truly be controlled without destroying the person inside? I watched one subject, a young woman, curl into a ball on the floor, her face contorted in terror. She muttered incoherently as though she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. I wanted to stop the experiment, but something within me held me back. It was too late for that. There was no turning back now. I found myself questioning everything. What was I doing? Was this really for the greater good, or had I become the very monster I had feared? The moral conflict gnawed at me, eating away at the resolve I had so carefully constructed. The dream of control, of absolute power over the human mind, felt more like a nightmare now. The cracks in my psyche were beginning to show, and I could no longer pretend that this was just a scientific endeavor. It was no longer about control or power. It was about survival, my own survival, and the survival of whatever humanity I had left. But I couldn't stop. I had gone too far to turn back now. As the days passed, the results of the MKUltra experiments began to take on an eerie unpredictability. The subjects, once ordinary men and women, were changing, but not in ways we had anticipated. Some began to develop unnervingly heightened awareness, as if their senses were tuned to a level beyond normal human perception. Their eyes would flicker with a strange understanding of the world around them, absorbing every detail, even the smallest nuances of sound, smell, and movement. They seemed to see beyond the walls of the sterile lab, as if they had unlocked something deep within their minds. Others, however, spiraled into madness. They screamed in incoherent fits, their voices trembling with fear and rage. One man began to claw at his own skin, convinced that something invisible was crawling beneath it. His skin tore in jagged lines as he cried out, "They're inside me!" The sight was disturbing, but I knew it was the price of discovery. We were testing the boundaries of the human mind, and it was fracturing under the pressure. But then there was a subject who terrified us in a completely different way. He sat quietly, his face eerily calm, eyes closed, as if in deep thought. When we spoke to him, he responded without hesitation, his voice slow and measured. At first, we thought he was simply another victim of the drugs, a passive participant in the chaos. But over time, something changed. He became unnervingly obedient, following every command without question. Then came the moment that made my stomach churn. During a session, I asked him to perform a simple task, to pick up a pen from the table. To my astonishment, he looked at the other subjects and told them to sit down in a voice so commanding that they did just that. No force, no violence, just simple obedience. He could control them. A chill ran down my spine. This wasn't just the drug-taking effect. This was something else entirely. He had become a conduit of control, effortlessly bending the wills of others, suggesting that mind control might actually work. But at what cost? Was this the power we sought to harness? As days turned into weeks, we watched in stunned silence as the subjects became more unpredictable. Some began to fight back, rejecting the drugs, the manipulation, anything that threatened their autonomy. They would scream, thrash, and struggle against their restraints, but it wasn't just physical resistance. Some subjects started to exhibit bizarre behaviors, like one woman who, in a sudden moment of clarity, declared, "I found it. I found the truth. The world is not what you think." She spoke with an eerie calmness, her eyes wide, as if she had glimpsed some forbidden knowledge. Their resistance was alarming. The drugs were supposed to break them, to make them pliable, but instead, they were fighting back with an unexpected ferocity. Some began to communicate in ways that couldn't be explained. They whispered to each other, their voices soft, barely audible. But when I listened closely, I could hear the distinct pattern of words. They were talking to each other, or perhaps something else. The CIA demanded immediate results. Our progress had stalled, and the higher-ups were growing impatient. They needed proof. They needed to see something that resembled success, something tangible that could be used. They pushed us to go further, to take more risks, to use the most extreme measures we had at our disposal. And so we did. The experiments grew darker. We administered higher doses of LSD, left the subjects in complete isolation for longer periods, and introduced psychological manipulation that was nothing short of torturous. We tested their limits, pushing them beyond the threshold of what was considered humane. But it wasn't just the subjects who were changing. I could feel it too. The weight of the experiment was bearing down on me. The pressure from the CIA, the pressure to succeed, was suffocating. I had gone too far to back out now. The results, the success, was within reach. But the cost was becoming clear. I had become a prisoner of my own ambition. The lines between right and wrong were no longer clear. I had crossed into a territory where morality no longer applied, where the desire for success had taken over. As the experiment continued, I could feel myself slipping away. I had been so focused on controlling the minds of others that I had forgotten about my own. I had become a puppet in my own creation, my will bending to the pressure of success and failure, and yet I couldn't stop. I had to push forward. The clock was ticking and I was running out of time. But with every step forward, the darkness closed in on me and the experiment spiraled further out of control. The breaking point came suddenly, violently. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. We had been warned about the risks, about the possibility of catastrophic failure. But no amount of preparation could have shielded me from the horror that unfolded in front of me. One of the subjects, a young woman, began to exhibit strange behavior. She had been quiet for days, her body still as if frozen in time. At first I assumed she had merely reached a state of passive compliance. But then the whispers started. It was subtle at first, a faint murmur from the corner of the room. She spoke in a language I didn't recognize, words tumbling out like a stream of consciousness, too rapid and chaotic to decipher. I leaned closer to the observation window, straining to hear her words, but the recording equipment only picked up static. And then something changed. Her voice cracked, and when she spoke again, it wasn't her voice. The voice that emerged was deep, guttural, alien, an unearthly growl that seemed to echo in the very walls of the room. She spoke with certainty, as if she were addressing someone far beyond us. "You have broken me. Now you will hear me." I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. The voice wasn't human. It was something else. The drug, the manipulation, the control, it had taken hold in ways I couldn't comprehend. I watched, helpless, as the subject's body jerked in unnatural spasms, her eyes rolling back and her head tilting at an impossible angle. The line between mind control and possession had been obliterated. The horror of it was compounded by the CIA's growing demands. They didn't care about the damage. They didn't care about the lives we had ruined. They only wanted results. They wanted proof that mind control was possible, no matter the cost. "You will make this work," they told me, their voices cold and mechanical, as though they couldn't comprehend the destruction we had already unleashed. "You will succeed, or you will never leave this room." Their words fueled my obsession, the fire that had already consumed my soul. I couldn't stop now. Success was within reach. But as the pressure mounted, I could feel the weight of my own sanity slipping away. The final straw came when another subject, a man who had shown signs of complete mental submission, began to speak as well. His words were similar, but with a terrifying twist. "I hear them. They are inside me now. They know your thoughts. You have awakened them." The words sent a shock through my body, like a bolt of lightning. This wasn't just a matter of breaking the mind. This was something else, something far darker. The experiment had gone too far. The subjects weren't just reacting to the drugs. They were becoming vessels for something unknown, something that had taken root within their minds. I couldn't breathe. The walls seemed to close in on me, suffocating me in the darkness of my own creation. I had been so focused on controlling the minds of others that I had forgotten to protect my own. Now I was too deep, too far gone. The guilt gnawed at me, but it wasn't just guilt. It was fear, a deep, suffocating fear that I had lost control of everything. The experiment had become a living nightmare, and I had become its architect. The paranoia crept in slowly at first. Late at night, when the lab was quiet, I would hear footsteps behind me. I would glance over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The whispers followed me, too soft to understand, but loud enough to unsettle me. Were they the voices of the subjects? Or had the experiment begun to take root within me? I locked myself in my office, but it didn't matter. The shadows still followed me. The faces of the subjects haunted me, their eyes wide with terror and understanding. They weren't just victims. They had become something else, something that had transcended the physical boundaries of the body. And I had made them that way. I couldn't escape. I could feel them watching me from the corners of my mind. Their presence was inescapable. The horrifying realization came in the silence of that final night. The experiment had not just controlled the minds of the subjects, it had controlled me too. I had become a part of the experiment, just another puppet in its twisted play. The darkness was closing in, and there was no way out. I write this confession from the shadows, hiding from the very thing I created. The walls feel too close, the air too thick, and the silence too oppressive. It has been days, perhaps weeks, since I last saw another human face. I am alone, but not truly. The footsteps echo down the empty corridors of the facility, soft, deliberate, as though someone is following me. Or perhaps it's something else. The whispers never stop. They swirl around me in the darkness, growing louder each night, each moment I am awake. I hear them in the walls, in the corners of my mind. I don't know if I'm still sane. I no longer trust my thoughts, my memories. Everything is a blur, a haze, like waking from a dream that I can't escape. I can't remember when the voices began or when the shadows started to appear in the corners of my vision. But I know they are real. They are here with me. The experiment has never ended. It's still with me, following me wherever I go. The subjects, the ones I thought I controlled, they've become something else. They live in the dark corners of my mind, their eyes watching me even when I close my own. Their voices call to me, beckoning me into the void where I've lost myself. I thought I could escape. I thought that by locking myself away, I could put an end to it. But there is no escape from what I've done. They are always there, always waiting. And now I hear them, not in the hallways, not behind closed doors, but inside my head. I am not alone anymore. The experiment has claimed me just as it claimed them. I hear their whispers. I see their eyes. It never left. And if you're listening to this now, perhaps it found you too.